Well, I think unfortunately we don't have a quorum of our town, our future, but maybe maybe we can at least begin having the conversation. I know we have Joan on the line here, and I know everybody's time is valuable. So maybe I don't know. So Loretta, did you have anything you want to say to open up conversation at least this point? Oh, now we have a quorum. We're all set. I'll call this meeting to order here at 8:03. And if the other members of our town or future don't have a problem, I'd like to jump to new business 5A, a discussion with Joan Nichols, Director of the Connecticut Farm Bureau. And maybe Loretta, I'll let you, as you were asked to kind of gather some folks together to have a conversation or discussion this evening. Maybe you'd like to give us a little introduction.
Sure. We during the summer and earlier in the year, we had some conversations at Conservation Commission about farming and what's happening in farming nowadays and new ways of farming and what does that mean and what does that impact on Ashford as a town, which is a rural town, and certainly we have supported farming in our town, but also our commission has supported the farmers market for 16 years now. And so I have talked in the past with Joan about farming and issues and other things coming along. And so I checked in with her and she talked about a lot of the new things that are happening now and more like scientific farming, if you will, and ran into her at the Sustainable Award ceremony. And we talked again about would she be willing to come and talk with us and share some of what she knows about farming and be available for questions for people. So she was more than happy to do that and sort of rearranged and hastened her schedule, which is why we're meeting at 8, so that she could be with us and share her insights and be available for questions that we might have. So with that, I'll introduce Joan Nichols, who is very, very knowledgeable about farming in Connecticut.
So thank you, Loretta, and thank you, Mike, and thank you to the Ashford Ag Commission for inviting me this evening. So just a little backstory, probably for the last 10 or 12 years, periodically, I've worked with the town of Ashford on zoning regulations. I remember, I don't know how many years ago when you sort of revised your regulations to what may be now the current version. And I was happy to do that at the time. I helped out Ashford and as well as many other towns across the state. So here we are in 2022. And what we're seeing is, and I think what we're going to see, continue to see in Connecticut, and in the Northeast and in a good part of the United States, is farmers are going to have to find and are finding different ways to produce food. Part of this is profitability. Part of it is when you're in a northern climate like we are, we're limited by our growing season. And part of it is consumer demand. Consumers are looking to get more and more fresh, locally grown food throughout the year. And we have this evolving, looming problem of climate change. This year our farmers experienced severe drought in a good part of the state. And last year we were looking at severe flooding. And then 2 years ago or 3 years ago, we were another drought. So, weather has always been the bane of existence for farmers. It could be their best friend or it can be their worst enemy. But now we are in 2022 and there's now emerging technology to help farmers produce food 12 months out of the year using a variety of different systems. Some of them are climate controlled indoor agriculture. And many of that has been utilized by the horticultural industry in Connecticut for for years, and our greenhouse industry and nursery industry is the largest sector of Connecticut agriculture. And it's quickly being realized that if we can grow plants and monitor their health and their growth throughout the variety of seasons we have in Connecticut and the Northeast, why couldn't we do the same thing for food? So now that's what we're seeing. And I will say, and this was a conversation that Loretta and I had at the Sustainable CT, and I've had this actually with other towns in Connecticut, is that we in Southern New England are sort of way behind the rest of the country, the rest of North America, and the rest of the world. Technology to grow food 12 months out of the year in more controlled environments has been going on in other parts of the country. It's been going on in Canada for many, many, many years. I always use the example, if you buy a cucumber in the wintertime, people think it comes from California or Florida. More often than not, it comes from Ontario. And of course, in other parts of the world, they've been utilizing technology and controlled environment ag for decades. So we're just behind. And though myself and folks at UConn have been saying all along that this technology, we're going to see it, and we're going to see farming look different in Connecticut. Not to say that our conventional farming is not going to stay here. And there are certain crops that are not conducive to more controlled technology, hay production, some vegetable production, livestock production, you know, is still going to stay fairly conventional looking. But I think on the fruit production and possibly not fruit, but vegetable production, certainly. And as time goes on, other types of food production, we're going to start to see that look different. And the last thing I'll say is that Connecticut is what I call the land of steady habits, and people just don't like change. They don't like things looking differently. They don't like the landscape looking differently. They don't like structures being built on farms that look different than what they used to, which is, you know, conventional looking barns or greenhouses. So with that, I know you have a project in Ashford that you approved. And I see Luther here. Nice to see you, Luther. And you know what Luther's trying to do in Ashford is, you know, maybe the first in Connecticut, but it's long overdue. So that being said, I'm happy to answer questions or open it up for discussion. I've overwhelmed you.
I know.
And I think I go ahead.
Oh, hi, it's Janet.
Hi, Janet.
Hi, Joan. Nice to see you again.
Thank you.
I was interested in what's going on in Ontario. What kind of facilities they have and what are they growing there? And would you anticipate that Connecticut would be doing the same thing eventually?
I haven't been up there. There was a sort of a road trip of a bunch of folks that went up there a few years ago, and I wasn't able to attend at the time. So I'm sort of speaking secondhand. But what I understand is they're basically greenhouses that are growing food. And I think part of the reason that they can do this, and they've been doing it in Canada, is first of all, it's Canada. So talk about, you know, a cold climate and even more, weather, you know, longer winter than we have. But the other thing, more importantly, is that Canada has readily available access to natural gas. And so with natural gas, they have the capacity to heat the greenhouses throughout the winter, which in Connecticut, and I see Luther shaking his head, so I'm going to ask him to weigh in on this as well. One of the challenges, even for our greenhouse industry now in Connecticut, is access to a reliable, affordable heating system. Some of our really big greenhouses have gone to wood-fired big biomass furnaces, mostly utilizing wood chips, not round wood. And those greenhouses that can hook up to natural gas are doing so, but a lot of Connecticut still doesn't have access to natural gas. So that's one of the reasons why Canada is way ahead of us. Luther, do you want to weigh in?
Joan, I would just say you've pretty well nailed it. Janet, the Canadian greenhouse operation really closely mimics the Dutch glass conventional model that has sort of been replicated all across Europe really successfully, where there's, like Joan said, huge natural gas access and a lot of government subsidies into that. And that's basically Canada's model. It's very energy intensive. The only reason I think they're able to do it with any kind of sustainability from a cost perspective is because of the really cheap access to the fossil fuels that they have.
Thank you. So yeah, that I was just going to say too, it's my recollection from speaking to folks who went on that trip up there that they are the more conventional glass greenhouses that we're used to seeing with large greenhouse operations.
So that would mean that the produce that we're getting from there really has a very high carbon footprint between growing it with natural gas and transporting it to Connecticut.
I wasn't prepared to answer that question.
Okay.
The whole carbon footprint. I mean, part of the reason, if we want to talk about the carbon footprint, and that, that can go in both directions. If we don't produce, think of it this way, if we don't start producing food 12 months out of the year in Connecticut, where does our food come from now? 2,000 miles away.
Right.
So, I am a strong proponent of, local jobs. The example I'll give you is one of our big green bean producers, Fairweather Acres, that's Billy Collins over in Rocky Hill. They farm, I don't know, 400 to 600 acres all along the Connecticut River Valley. And Billy sells directly to Big Y. Big Y likes to promote that they're buying from local farms, and they do a pretty good job with it. But Billy even told me from the time his green beans leave the farm till the time they show up at the nearest Big Y is 4 to 5 days. And that's because even in Connecticut, they go into a warehouse distribution system. So when you start to think about it's 4 days before you get a green bean out of Rocky Hill, unless you go to the farm and buy it direct, how fresh is the food you get when it's been traveling from, California or Ontario or Chile or wherever else it comes from.
All right.
Joan, I'm wondering if you could, when we were talking, you talked a lot about what's going on in other farms in Connecticut now and how they're struggling and how they're meeting the struggle. Like one thing we talked about is bigger farms with bigger barns and all that. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that. And also some of the things I think that we talked about is with any sort of high-tech agriculture, the use of water. What's the difference and stuff like that? Because that was something that really shocked me when I heard that and I understood, the difference between conventional and regular agriculture and what some of these other alternative farming things are using is phenomenal, particularly now when we have these vacillations and the droughts have been, pretty consistent in our country, in Connecticut anyway.
Yeah, so what we've been seeing, and again, this is not just unique to Connecticut, you could say it's Southern New England, it's our region, to some extent, it's some parts, all of the United States, is we're seeing ongoing consolidation of farms, especially in Connecticut, primarily in the nursery and dairy industry. We're producing the same amount of milk, we have the same number of cows, but we just have less farms doing it. So one dairy farm is buying out another dairy farm. the nursery industry is doing the same thing. There's a lot of consolidation in the nursery industry. So if I were to say in general terms what the trends are in Connecticut is the bigger farms are getting bigger, a lot of consolidation. And part of that's sort of an interesting dynamic because people that don't understand the scale that farming needs to be at, they'll start to look at some of what we call the larger farms, right? Whether it's our dairy farms up in Ellington or, some of the bigger farm, greenhouse operations like we have in Lebanon and Summers. And they start to look at that and they go, oh, wait a minute, that now that's a commercial farm. Well, it's not a commercial farm. It's the same family, the same families. They've been farming in Connecticut for 3, 4, 5, 6 times, sometimes 7 generations. It's just that the farm's getting bigger and they've taken over other farms. And so sometimes scale bothers people because, they're used to seeing a cow barn with 150 or 200 head. They're not used to seeing a cow barn with 3,000 head. 3,000 head is in the big scheme of things, is a really small herd, when most of the United States is in the tens of thousands of, animals, for a dairy. So even 3,000 is big for Connecticut, but it's relatively small industry-wide. So, I think the bigger farms are getting bigger in the consolidation. There's certainly, I think the mid-sized farms are probably the ones that are most looking at diversification and, innovation and technology, because I think the mid-sized farms, they're not as large a scale as some of the bigger farms, but they also need to earn a profit if they're going to stay in business. And I also think that the next if these are multi-generational farms, the younger generation coming up, the 20, 30-year-olds, I think they want to stay on the farm, but they're going to do it differently. And then I think it's critically important for us to understand that there's still tremendous value in our smaller farms that are doing, small intensive permaculture and other practices. So I think the beauty of Connecticut is we can support and should support, the range of farming and the type of farming. But again, even the smaller farms, I have a diversified farm on the road I live in, Franklin, and she was traditionally a small dairy, and then she diversified into organic and vegetables and chickens and pork. And she put up one high tunnel, and it must have been successful because she put 2 more up. So, even those types of farms, you're starting to see more high tunnels, bigger high tunnels, longer high tunnels. So, and then to your point, Loretta, and maybe Luther can weigh in on this, because of climate change and water and soil, 2 incredibly precious resources that without either one of those in a healthy condition, the farms aren't going to be able to produce. And even our conventional farms are looking at, water conservation, metering, different ways of monitoring soil moisture, soil health. But some of these new, I'll just call it a closed system, actually uses less water and is able to sort of conserve and recycle. And Luther, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but do you have any insight in that as well?
Joan, I mean, I think it's safe to say that from an industry perspective, the things you were just talking about are very true, and they would be. I mean, you know a lot about this, but yeah, the pressure for production is really hard. The pressure from the weather is really hard. Specifically, when it comes to water, most production environments that are indoors and are managed environments can see a really significant reduction in water usage for the same crop that's grown outside. So what we've seen, I mean, specific to our project, we're using 90% less water than if those same crops were, if I just walked out to the field behind my house and put the same crop in the field behind my house, it's 90% water reduction. So in terms of resource management, it's really important. And in terms of soil management, I mean, when you look at a lot of the crops that are grown for food consumption, a lot of those are really tricky to do no-till. If you're doing automated harvest, you really need really flat, consistent soil beds. So there's a lot of tillage that goes into food production, and tillage results in soil loss. And so, yeah, everything we can do for mitigating water loss and soil loss is really important, to Joan's point.
So Joan, there's talk about water. There's also talk about electricity. These indoor farms use a substantial amount of electricity too. I'd just like to comment about the water too. While you can get the same production, you know, how do I say this? It's high intensity use of water too. I believe in the some projects they use wells to get water from the groundwater. That's going to have an impact on a high impact in a large indoor facility on the local groundwater resources, potentially on other things, on the surrounding environment. I'm sure there's ways to recycle water, but I'm also concerned about the impact on the community. You know, electricity requires, you know, these places require a substantial amount of electricity. Infrastructure needs to be built to bring that infrastructure to often a remote area. You know, farms are not necessarily on close to the grid and close to that infrastructure. And there's also traffic, not to mention the loss of farmland. You mentioned that these are going to become increasingly popular. Well, that means that farmland, which is already under pressure, you know, for use in solar farms and developments. We all know farmland's fast disappearing in Connecticut. That farmland is going to look very different if these things become popular. So there's a, you know, if you could speak to electricity use and impact on the farmland, rural character that we all enjoy too. Love to hear what you have to say about that.
Sure. I mean, all important points, Steve, and all considerations that farmers, communities, Farm Bureau is keenly aware of. As far as water usage is concerned, every farm uses water. Every farm. And more, and I've lost track of how many farmers in the last two droughts, I'll just call the last two droughts, have had to drill wells or drill more wells. And these are conventional growers. So if we're going to produce food, or we're going to feed livestock, or we're going to produce milk, we're going to use water. And we're going to use water whether there's a drought or not a drought. They need the water. The livestock has to be watered. The cows have to be watered. The crops need water. So I'm not an expert in any of this. As a general ag organization, I like to say I need to know enough to be dangerous, but I'm by no means an expert in any of this. There are folks at University of Connecticut that could answer this far more wisely than I can. But my cursory knowledge, and I do have a soils background, is we lose water to evaporation. I mean, that's just That just happens, right? So to Luther's point, if he's growing these similar crops and using 90% less water, that's the data I need. So I think that speaks to that, because wells are being drilled. That's just the way it is. And they're going to have, and the other thing that's happened is something called the Food Safety Modernization Act. The Food Safety Modernization Act was passed under the Obama administration. And under the Food Safety Modernization Act is something, the first rule that came out was called the Produce Safety Rule. And under the Produce Safety Rule, and what they call GAP, Generally Accepted Agricultural Practices, which is what most supermarkets, almost any wholesale establishment requires that farms are GAP certified. They no longer want to see water coming out of surface water. The days of putting a hose in a pond and using it to water your crops, not to say it can't be done and it can't be done safely, but there's really a push to take more and more irrigation water especially for vegetable production from wells, because of a variety of concerns over drawing water from surface ponds. So that's the water end of it. On the energy end of it, and again, I'm no expert on this, but it's my understanding, and even farms that aren't doing this type of production, I don't know any farm that's looking at using renewable energy. And whether they're putting solar panels on their barn roofs or they're doing a ground mount just to power the farm. I'm not saying to do a commercial array where they're selling the power off grid, just to power the farm. In fact, there's been quite a bit of legislation passed in the last few years to allow farms to do virtual net metering so that they can maximize the use of the renewable energy that's available and the renewable energy credits to offset the farm's energy needs. And all of that comes with the use of technology.
I
So-
have a question about technology, is in that you started off saying that new technology is going to be the driving force for changing the way that agriculture is going, and we're looking at climate change, we're looking at things that we hope to be able to control at some point. And I'd be interested to know, and perhaps you don't know, but perhaps you know where to find the information. I suspect that there is some driving forces globally to try to understand and develop new techniques for agriculture to feed an increasing population using less non-renewable resources, particularly fossil fuel driven, because we really, as a population, need to get away from that or we're kind of doomed. But I wondered where that's coming from, and globally, what are the models that are being developed, or if you don't know, how would we find out what's going on? Both obviously in Africa, there's going to be a different model than in Europe because there are different needs, but I suspect that scientists are looking at that fairly closely and, with some vigor. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, this is like a 2-week conference. This is not a conversation that I'm going to be able to answer in the elevator speech. It's not happening. I don't mean to be facetious, but there's a lot going on. It is the type of seed we're using, the type of, are we using genetics to improve the seed that's going to use less water and allow a root system to go down deeper than it does now so that the plant can survive with less water in sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, it's going on everywhere. It's in plant genetics, it's in water conservation measures, it's in, soil practices, it's everywhere. It's even in dairy. It's in the genetics in the cows. It's in the feed that goes into the cows. It's an incredibly exciting but very broad subject that I'm not going to be able to answer. And it depends on your commodity. And that's the other interesting thing in Connecticut. We grow everything. And even our own aquaculture industry, just to get a little off topic, the largest farms in Connecticut are under Long Island Sound. There's 73,000 acres of shellfish beds under Long Island Sound, of which at any one point in time, a third of it is in production. And even our shell fishermen are not farming shellfish the way they used to. It's changing. And at some point in time in Connecticut, we may see the first commercial oyster hatchery on the East Coast, because even our shell fishermen have to buffer their industry and their profitability against climate change. And nobody knows better than that than somebody that's farming in Long Island Sound. So it's a good question. It's very broad. And I will say, and I wanted to say this at the outset, I don't want to give you the impression that we're going to cover the state of Connecticut in greenhouses. I was at a meeting, a different group, and somebody brought up a screenshot of some large greenhouse operation in another part of the world. And somebody said, well, we don't want that in Connecticut. That's not going to happen in Connecticut because of the diversity of crops that we grow in this state, the topography we have, and the climate. I mean, it's all different, and the cost to invest in these types. But even if you're a conventional farmer, you're going to be looking at technology. And right here in Connecticut, just the last legislative session, it's important enough that we got $14 million for climate smart ag. 7 million is a brand new program, of which, as we speak, I'm going to be applying for $1.5 million of that, so that we can serve farmers to buy equipment, monitoring equipment, whatever they're going to need to address climate change. And we're just one grant applicant. So whether it's drills, no-till drills, whether it's whatever it is, I don't know, I'm not a farmer. But there's technology, there's equipment, there's even the farmer up the road from me. I said, Sarah, what do you want if I get this grant? And she said, I could use more. I forget what she calls them, cat tunnels. She calls them cat tunnels. And they're little, I see them in her field, and these little hoops that she spreads out over her crops. And she said, if I can triple the amount of cat tunnels I use, I could use more cat tunnels. I don't think they're very expensive, but for a farmer like her, sure, put a grant application in, Sarah. We'd love to have you have more cat tunnels, if that will extend your growing season and help reduce your water and protect your soil. Absolutely. And she's an organic grower.
Hey, Joan, kind of a follow-up to what you're talking about.
Sure.
Is there an overall strategy or game plan that the state has put forward, or is it kind of going to be driven more by the individual farmers at this point, and some seed money and innovation, so to speak? I mean, because obviously Ashford is a more rural community, and obviously a lot of, I mean, my career saw a lot of conflict points between farmers and residents, so to speak, and just how do towns, I guess looking for some guidance as to what the strategy is from the state perspective, and how towns can prepare themselves to be partners with both the farmers and the residents, of course, in growing this industry, because the reality I think we are facing is that we need to be producing more stuff closer to home, or else it's not going to get here because of fuel costs, whatever, or the, as we all saw during the pandemic, the issue with getting things moved anywhere. So, I mean, again, so one question, is there an overall strategy, and what are some of the recommendations that the farming industry and your group are providing to towns? Is how do we manage this moving forward to create the partnerships between the farmers and the residents, and so everybody feels at peace and happiness and can get something out of it?
Yeah, I mean, all good question. Is there a broad-based, policy? I think we're writing it as we speak, literally. It all starts with the farmers. It always does. And I'm not saying this because Connecticut Farm Bureau is a grassroots organization. Everything we do starts with the farmers. The farmers come to us and say, we need help with this, or we need policy on this. And then we work our way up to Hartford, and sometimes we work our way up to Washington. Always starts with the farmers. If the farmers want to keep farming the way they are, and they can make money farming the way they are, we won't have these conversations. But apparently they can't, or they're not, or they need to change. So, Seth Baylor is a classic example up in Ellington. I forget how many generations they've been farming. And he finally, when he took the farm over, he said, I can't keep using these old barns anymore. They're not efficient. The milking system isn't efficient anymore. And I'm not going to be able to be the next generation dairy farmer if I don't do something different. And, put up a 7-acre cow barn. And nobody had ever seen a 7-acre cow barn in Connecticut, but there's a 7-acre cow barn in Ellington. That came from the farmer. If he said, I can keep living and working with the barns I have, then you'll keep, so it always starts with the farmers. How the state of Connecticut reacts to help the farmers and support them, certainly from Farm Bureau's perspective, that's what we're here for. If the farmers didn't come to us for support and help, we'd be out of business. The Department of Ag, I think, is very proactive in being responsive. And whether it's, weighing in on decisions on farmland preservation easements, or looking at, modifying their grant program, which they're going to be doing with the next $7 million going into the farmland restoration program. And there's going to be some modifications to this next round of grant funding for farmland restoration to expand what the money can be used for. And then it comes from policy from Hartford. And if the farmers are vocal enough and they feel they need things, then it's driven by policy and eventually lawmakers, and then at some point funding. The virtual net metering is a classic example. The farm said, we need to address our energy needs. And it's expensive to operate in Connecticut. We have high electric rates, and we need to do something different. We need virtual net metering for the farms. So that's what we got, virtual net metering for the farms. Farms say, we want to put anaerobic digesters. We want to be able to offset our own electric needs. We want to be environmentally, find a better way to environmentally manage our manure system and our manure waste. And we want to be part of helping Connecticut with their renewable energy portfolio. That starts with the farmers. If a farmer doesn't want to put an anaerobic digester in, they're not going to. But the farm said, we need policy and laws to allow us to do anaerobic digesters, and to allow anaerobic digesters to be part of Connecticut's renewable energy portfolio, so we can be competitive in the marketplace in energy credits. Now we have policy to support on-farm anaerobic digesters. So, I mean, when you look at footprints, who knows? At some point, there may be a dairy farmer. I mean, there's one Fort Hill Farm in Thompson. She has an anaerobic digester. Baylor's is building another anaerobic digester. High Tone Farm in Coventry is finishing their anaerobic digester. There's going to be another one coming to Franklin. Two of them, a biogas injection. That's technology to be able to turn cow manure and provide power to 12,000 houses in Thompson. But if you've ever seen an anaerobic digester, it is big, and it's like nothing you've ever seen before. It's like dumping a spaceship on a piece of farmland. But they don't put them on the best farmland. They put them on the gravel pits or the places that they're not. That's the other thing. The farmers don't put these things in places that is going to compromise their soil or their productive land. They're going to put them in places that make the most amount of sense for the farm. And to answer the question about how municipalities are going to respond, I mean, a few years ago, I remember working with Ashford, there was a huge push for agritourism, right? Remember the agritourism? We're still talking about agritourism. So what did the towns do? We responded. How can we allow farms to do certain things on the farm that's in harmony with the community, and you adopt zoning regulations? But I think what's going to happen with communities is the discussion like we're having tonight, that bucolic hayfield that you're used to looking at may have a big building on it sometime. It's farmland, it's a farm, but it's not going to look like it does now. And people, I think 9 times out of 10, we're not talking about food production or farming, we're talking about aesthetics. And I don't know how you regulate what people like or don't like the look of.
So Joan, one thing that it seems some urban areas are actually generating, they're doing things like indoor greenhouses. I believe there's one in Rhode Island in Providence. They took an old facility and turned it into an indoor farming facility, and it makes a lot of sense because they are very close to infrastructure, including water, electricity. It solves, and it points out that many of these types of structures, for indoor farming, really don't need to be on farmland. It may make a lot more sense to put them in industrial areas that have, gone by the wayside, and they're even closer to markets, like if they're in a city. But sort of back to the towns, what do towns have to worry about? Well, I think it came out from our conversation that hydrology is kind of important. The potential use of a high intensity growing structure speaks to intensive use of water and also electricity. So I think towns need to consider that more than, and how it impacts the rest of the community and the surrounding environment. And then, how it also impacts neighbors and like you said, aesthetics. You mentioned that there's farmers and then there's the state, but there's actually quite a bit of control, potential control, and within each town. Zoning laws exist or don't exist. In many cases, in Ashford, farmers get the benefit of not having to go before PZC if their structure meets building permits. That's what our zoning enforcement officers told me. And
isn't that like any other resident there, Steve? Any other resident, if they meet the regulations, it doesn't, not a farmer, anyone, the garage mechanic or the person owning whatever piece of land? Isn't that the requirement? If they meet the regulations, then they don't need to go to anything special?
Well, I think virtually every commercial establishment in town goes before a PZC to get a permit, to build, like Dollar General or any other one. And why, I don't want to argue about any particular thing, but really large structures in Ashford probably should be reviewed.
Okay, do we have any other questions for Joan? I appreciate you, Joan, taking the time. I know you're a busy person for sure, but go ahead, Jeff.
Actually, I know Doug had his hand up earlier. Doug, did you
Okay.
have something you wanted to say
I
before
thought
I
he was
go?
petting his dog. Sorry.
That really was a dog, but actually, while we're on this topic, I just want to kind of explain a couple things that my wife and I are doing here. We are a registered farm in the state of Connecticut, Coruscant Farm on Cushman Road. We're a very, very small operation. Effectively, I guess some people may call you like a hobby farm or something, but fundamentally what we're doing is we're trying to be as resourceful as we possibly can, and live off our land and provide something back to our community. So a couple of years ago, I came up with this idea of a solar greenhouse because my wife is a gardener and she wants to be able to grow her vegetables all year round. And while I did model it after what I've seen in more sunny winter environments such as Colorado, I still took a gamble and designed it and built it. And we've been operating past couple of years with it. And we can at least grow our greens all year round now. And where there's very, very little resource usage of that building. I have a little bit of electricity going out there for lights, but we never really turn the lights on because we could see everything that we're doing with the sunlight. We've converted our garden a couple of years ago to full no-till. I got tired of having to till it every year, and my wife was doing research, and now we just throw leaves and untreated wood chips and everything in, and it just keeps feeding itself. And all our cow manure gets spread back onto the pastures for fertilizer for the cows grazing in the summers. So it's a much different scale than some of the very large operations, but it's our way of trying to figure out how to keep moving along with everything that's changing. Because as Joan said earlier, the environment certainly is changing. The flooding last year, the Knowlton Brook behind me overflowed into my pond and into my lower pasture. I'd never in a million years thought that it would rise 5, 8+ feet that it did. But then this summer, complete drought. I had to take the animals off the pasture in July and feed hay. I had to go buy hay when I usually don't have to do that until the end of September. So just some observations of what we're doing in along similar lines, but just on like I said, a different scale.
Thanks for sharing. Yes, sir, Mr. Silversmith.
Joan, thank you again for joining us and speaking to us. And hopefully we've brought in a lot of different groups to hear the input that you're sharing. I just have a couple of comments and kind of just a clarifying thing from something you said earlier. First off, without a degree, and in many cases, a lot of present company excluded on this. Without a degree, farmers really turn out to be the engineers of daily life. I mean, they have a need, they have a problem, and there aren't a lot of people around to help them fix it, and they fix it themselves. And they come up with a way that's both, as you stated, it doesn't compromise their land, it doesn't, it makes them hopefully more efficient. It gives them a better way of doing things with, as Doug was saying, with the material that they have. And they've kind of been through the years, the homegrown engineers at all times. The other thing I just wanted to say was that, and when agriculture, and Mike asked this question earlier, and it also could be a 2-day seminar, I'm sure, regarding agriculture, I don't want to say versus, but via planning and zoning and residential. And again, Ashford has always highly valued agriculture. We're very prideful about it, if you will. and it's in and out and inundated in our POCD. But again, we also don't have developers knocking down our door trying to put up land, and the land is minimal in Ashford. I mean, the really only buildable land that's not wetlands, that's not on a shelf of some type, though dynamite is a great invention and it's helped out a lot, is farmland. And we don't want to see a lot of that farmland turned into things like being sold off and farmers having to leave and turn it into developments and things like that. The last thing I have is just something you mentioned earlier. It was kind of the difference between a commercial and a non-commercial venture for a farm. And I suppose by definition, anything commercial is anything that sells beyond its own means as either, you know, wholesale, retail, or whatever, beyond a certain value or certain amount of material being sold. So I guess when it comes to something being commercial or non-commercial, in a lot of people's view, it tends to be, as you said, scalable. I mean, to what scale are they being a commercial venue versus, I mean, all farms, unless they are making food for just their family and themselves, really are a commercial venue. And again, it's that definition of scale as to how much and how large. And again, I really appreciate your earlier point regarding the things that are going on in Connecticut, everything from increasing our growing season, which in some years is 6 months or 7 months, and in some years might get to be 9 months, but we still lose about 25% of our growing season. Profitability, keeping our farmers viable, keeping them in place, keeping them able to, again, not only feed their families, but one of the reasons they're in farming is to turn a profit, to make it a profitable venue so that they are successful. And again, you know, some of the things about climate change and all too, that's an offset of something that is extremely difficult to, at this point in time, to, what's the word I'm looking for, to guess, to figure out what it's going to be. You know, as Doug said, he can go from a drought to a flood in a matter of a year. It doesn't matter. So again, that was mostly a lot of statements being said, but I think the biggest thing is that one of the things I was just thinking about is it's maintaining those farmers, maintaining them to be allowed and not selling off the land is very important for those that want to maintain the bucolic nature, the rural characteristic, and just the beauty that we have in Ashford, in and around Ashford. So thank you.
You're welcome. And I just like to respond. I mean, all the comments, Doug's, your comments are, you know, spot on, and Jeff and everybody else's comments, and certainly the concerns that have been raised. Listen, there's no easy answer to any of this. If there was an easy answer, you wouldn't have me at this meeting, right? So, you know, but, you know, I guess the takeaway from all of this is that, and to really, to Jeff's point and to Doug's and everybody else's, if you want, we want to eat, right? We all eat, right? I haven't eaten supper yet. I want to go eat supper. So I volunteer on Monday nights, actually at a barn. I just got home and the horses have eaten, but I haven't. So we all want to eat. I just as soon have food from my neighbor farm up the road than someplace else. But we also have to realize that farming is not going to stay the same. We're not using draft horses and plows anymore. Some people are, it's cool. I like horses, but you know, it's gonna look different, to Doug's point. Even on his operation, and that's great, Doug, that experiment is awesome, right? It looks different, right? It has to. So, you know, we can accept the fact that things are gonna look different, and how do we have to modify what we do and respond to neighbors. And I think at the end of the day, and I've said this all along, if the farm is following generally accepted agricultural practices, there's no wetlands concerns, they're protecting their soil, which I don't know anybody that knows a better job of protecting soil than farmers. The farm's doing everything right, and they're checking all the boxes from an environmental standpoint. And we can produce food locally and, create some construction jobs, some local jobs. The labor and employment, that's a whole other problem. And if some of these types of operations can do it in a more labor efficient manner, that's a whole other problem. I mean, we can't talking about labor, that's a nightmare right now, and it's going to continue to be a nightmare. So, some automation that helps, less water usage, fantastic. So, I mean, it's happening as we speak. The state wouldn't have put $14 million out there last year if they didn't think that this was important. So it's a matter of how adaptable communities are going to be.
And I think resiliency and sustainability are the key phrases. I know they're the buzzwords, so that they are for farmers as to how to move forward in the future. Anybody else that hasn't talked, that want to speak? Or I see Luther, you have a hand up. You want to chime in?
I just very briefly, I wanted to thank Joan, but I also wanted to mention one of the things we didn't talk about in the need for evolution in farming. It's running in parallel with some of the other pressures that towns are seeing across the country. And it has to do with an aging population, right? So just like the rest of the town, farmers are aging in place, and they're trying to age in place. And so farmers are having to try to come up with innovative ways to continue to drive revenue from their farms, with the understanding that they're not going to be able to go out and be as physical as they once were. And so that's yet another driving force for innovation in agriculture beyond cost constraints, resource constraints, fiscal constraints. It's the labor force. On a lot of farms, we're a small farm. We're in a farming scale, we're very small. We're 213 acres. So Doug's farming on under 10. He's small. We're farming on over 200. We're still really small in the scale of farming, really small. So all our labor is in-house, but you can't sustain the same levels of inputs from a labor perspective as you age. So you have to look for innovation. And that's, just wanted to mention, that's another one of the drivers that I think towns are going to have to address, similar like the housing concerns, where residents want to be able to age in place and have regulations that accommodate that. It's going to be a similar thing for farmers trying to age in place on their farms.
Okay.
Joan, you have a broad picture of what's happening in Connecticut. I wondered, do you see corporations leasing Connecticut farmland to do, let's say, these indoor agriculture projects? Would you see that becoming it kind of speaks to Luther's point too, an aging farming population. You get farmers who can't work the land so much anymore. And so they choose to lease their land, so that structures can be built. And do you see that happening around the state at all?
I'm not quite sure how to answer that question. I'm not sure what you mean by corporations.
Well, okay.
Are you talking about? I'm not quite sure. Like,
other than landowner enterprises, people leasing farmland to scale it up for various projects, I could imagine, there could be some large dairy operation in another state that has decided, okay, we want to scale up a Connecticut operation. That's probably not a great example, but they would come in and, take over a dairy farm, essentially. Do you see that happening? I think you sort of alluded to the fact that that does happen.
No, that I haven't seen that.
Okay.
What I had mentioned earlier is that the farms that have been here, dairy and nursery, have gotten bigger. So as one dairy farm sells or gets out of the dairy industry, which we're down to now under 100 dairy farms left in Connecticut. I think there's 96 or so dairy farms left. So one farm just buys the land from another dairy farmer. It's the same family. It's just that they've taken over another farm. Hillendales, which is the third largest egg producer in the United States, farms in Basra, Franklin, Colchester, and Lebanon. They are the very, very, very large football size laying houses. That is a family-owned operation. So it's big, it's really big, but it's a family-owned operation. So again, when we start talking about, I mean, a farm, if it's a business, they may be incorporated. It could be an LLC, an S corporation, a C corporation. They're a company, but it's a farm and they're the farmers. So I'm not, and honestly, Connecticut is so, and this is my takeaway, and I don't have any good way to say it, so I'm just going to say it, and I'm sorry. Connecticut is a very difficult state to do business in and to farm. Land, we've got, I forget, we're in the top 10 for the highest cost of farmland in the country. If you don't own family-owned land, or you're not fortunate enough to inherit land, if you're starting out, and Doug, I don't mean to put you on the spot, if you're starting out and you're looking to purchase a piece of farmland, because you can only lease land for so long before you just want your own spot, frightfully expensive. We have high labor costs, high input costs. Even our truck weights are not comparable with our neighboring states. So we're at economic disadvantage on the transportation side, on the energy side, and on the land side. So to think if anybody is going to look at the state of Connecticut to invest, they're going to go Pennsylvania, upstate New York, down south, someplace else. In fact, the third largest egg producer here in Connecticut, they're based in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, but the owners are Connecticut, is a Connecticut family. And they're scratching their heads. They're on the they just finished $1.10 million expansion. They've got 2 more $100 million expansions, plus the renovation of the feed mill and the rail lines here in Franklin. And they're scratching their heads because Connecticut is so difficult. If they don't start to see some changes in input costs, they can go back to Pennsylvania. And we lose 400 farm jobs. They employ over 400 people, and they'll go to Pennsylvania. So it's a tough state. And I bless every farmer tries to make it here, because they have to be smart, innovative, and really dedicated. And that's all I can tell you.
Joan, I really appreciate your coming and talking to us. And I think these are the kinds of discussions that we need to have, so that it becomes the farmers and the non-farmers working together to take the best care of the land. And I think this is an ongoing process and an ongoing discussion. So I'm really glad that people from various committees and commissions in our town, you know, were able to get to this meeting, and also the farmers who were able to share some of their experiences, and of course your expertise. So I really appreciate it. And you know, so sorry you have to have a late supper, but it was worth it to us. So thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. And just, you know, a little takeaway, 80% of the lease land in the state is dairy support land. So without the availability of leased land, our dairy farmers couldn't make it, because they don't own enough land. They can't afford to buy all the land they need to grow the feed they need. So and there's competition here in Franklin and Lebanon. There's fierce competition for lease land. And they're going further and further away. And I don't know about you, I don't like driving my car on the road, let alone a farm tractor. You take your life in your hands lately, right? God bless anybody that wants to put farm machinery on a public road. I'm ready to get a Sherman tank. It's ridiculous driving around here. Awful. But anyhow, but that's a whole other discussion.
Well, thank you, Joan. Really
Thanks,
appreciate it.
Joan.
All right,
Good
always
luck.
good to see you folks, and thanks for the invite. Good night.
Thank you.
Right.
Bye.
Mike, thank you for the time on your meeting also. We appreciate it.
Yes,
and I
thanks.
appreciate everybody chiming in, and hope to see you all soon, in person even.
Thank you,
So-
Mike.
Be nice.
I don't know if Maureen and Glenn and Ray, you want to stick around, just talk about a couple things on our rest of our agenda, or anybody else would like to stick around as
Thank
well.
you, Mike.
Thanks, Mike,
Thank
for
you. Thank you,
adjusting
Mike.
the
No
time
problem.
of your meeting so that we could do this. I really appreciate it.
No,
And
no,
thanks
I-
everybody else for coming.
Thanks. Yep. Good conversation. Appreciate it. So we'll go back to item number 2 on our agenda, which is approval of minutes from November 7th. Everybody have a chance to look at those?
Mhm.
And have
I
a
move to
motion?
approve the minutes of the meeting from November 7th.
Have a second? No seconds? How about a third?
I'll second it. Was I there? If I was
Yes.
there, I'll second it.
Okay, thank you. All in favor, say aye. Opposed?
Aye.
Okay, thank you. Moving on. Communications and announcements. Anybody have any information you want to share? No? Okay, then we'll move to the old business. Follow up for the leadership meeting we had last month. I think we had over 24 attendees. Probably not as many people as we would have liked, but I think it was I think Jeff did a great job of kind of moving the meeting along and getting some great feedback. I sent out to everybody kind of my raw notes from the meeting. So if you have anything you want to add to it, I think we should, I'd like to kind of get out those notes in some form. If there's more information you want to put to them, at least everybody who attended the meeting kind of as a follow-up and get their input as well. And to kind of hopefully to stay connected with those that attended. After the meeting, I know Bill Folletti came to me, and he really wants to follow up with another meeting in the spring and wants to hopefully engage more community, people, particularly some of our civic organizations and some of the nonprofits. I know that last time we had some good participation by the Salvation Army group and a few others, some of the churches, and I think they kind of missed them a little bit there, but I think if we can get more of those folks involved, I think to further some of the conversations, because it was, it really was a lot of good information that came out of it. I think there's an opportunity to kind of take all this and generate a little more involvement of the community. Things will kind of be a springboard for the POCD update as well. But I don't know, you Glenn and Catherine, I see you're online, and Maureen, you were there. What are your thoughts on the meeting?
I thought the meeting was very good. I think people were pretty astute and very clear in what they were conveying. And a lot of good information came together. I'm looking forward to having the opportunity to work on the strategic plan.
Yep.
Because I think that, I think of our plan of conservation development as a living thing. I don't want to call it a roadmap, but it's something that tells us where our boundaries are and what our goals are. And so I want to see that get as beefed up as possible. And you have to have good plans in order to do that. So it's not a small task to do it. It's pretty huge, but I think it would be good for the town. And so I enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to the rest of it.
I thought it was a real positive experience also. really nice to hear everybody's viewpoint, to go around and hear some of the different people we hadn't heard from before.
Right.
And each time, you know, you get some new people, like
Yep.
Sportsman's Club. I mean, I mentioned this, some other people who wanted to be there who didn't get a chance, and like, oh, I would have liked to have heard, you know, that perspective. But I do think that there was like a thread, a common thread going around the room of what we wanted, like a similar vision for the future. It might be slightly different, but most people really came together and found common ground.
I was impressed with how seriously people took it. People came prepared. They didn't just show up. They put a thought into it before they came, and I was just really impressed with that. It's a great meeting.
Yeah, I think, you know, Catherine, to your point, I think, you know, I think a town of Ashford size, I think the POCD is really a great document compared to a lot of the, even cities, I'll say. And I think it's critical that the town, with the input we're seeing, that it's come together and develop like a strategic plan, like you said, a roadmap, a business plan. Because, you know, if the town doesn't, I mean, if you really want to, you know, things to be the way people want them, they always say there's rural character, whatever, you know, the things like that just don't continue to be on their own. They require, much like a garden, you know, if you want the vegetables to grow, you got to fertilize and water, and you got to pull out the weeds so they don't overtake the garden and let the vegetables grow. And much like the town, you've got to figure out your path moving forward and decide what's important, what isn't important, what you want to spend your energy, your resources, your funding. So I think that is a critical thing. And Gwen's point and Maureen's point, people came prepared, and I think there was those 4 or 5 items that's really stood out, and those remain to be the opportunities moving forward to really do some really great things. So I think, yeah, I think if we can engage more people to get more input into those topics, I think it bodes well for things that can be worked on in the future.
Well, when I think about it, I think about, you know, short term, where do we want to be? And then longer term, I don't know, I think it might have been Luther that said something about 10, 15 years, 20 years down the road. What do you want Ashford to be? And you have to go in that direction to get there, and not kind of this kind of scattergun thing where you have this issue comes up and, oh, we decide this way, but we haven't thought about what it's going to be if everybody is doing that, and it's, you know, kind of all loosey-goosey. So I'd rather see something that shows that we have a direction that we're going in, and that that there's agreement on what that direction should be.
Yep.
So.
And Ray, you're on the. Can you hear us, Ray? I mean, I don't know if you had a chance to look at some of the notes. I know you were a little under the weather that night. You were there in spirit, and then my handwriting kind of reflected yours, so I was there with you on that. So I don't know if you had a chance to look at any of the notes or have any thoughts at this time, Ray?
No, I don't, Mike. I did look at them briefly, but I can't add anything to what's already been said.
Yep. Okay, so I mean, at this point, if those of you on the line here, if you have any, you know, feedback or see anything with the notes that I put together that you want to add, or punctuation, spelling, or grammar stuff, I don't care. Any other thoughts you think I missed? Because I tried to read everybody's handwriting and try to put it into some form that kind of at least made sense to this Polish mind. But you know, yeah, so I'd like to kind of get that out before the holidays here, at least, so that we at least kind of circle back with everybody and let them know, hey, thanks for attending, and this is what we got so far. We'll see you in the spring. We're going to keep on working on it over the winter time.
Yeah, I'd like us to grow the momentum.
Yep, exactly.
Because, you know, if we don't come together often enough, and we don't, you know, start moving on some of these things, getting them into our plan of conservation development, et cetera, then we're just going to lose steam, and we'll lose people along the way. So anything we can do to kind of gin up the energy and start really doing some concrete things would be good.
Yeah, I was hoping that, I don't think it's going to happen at this point, just because I think we probably don't have it all the way we might want to have it, but to get something back in the citizen as well. So maybe we'll shoot for the next month is kind of formulate at least a bulleted summary to provide to the in the Ashford for the February issue. So that'd be another thing I'd look for everybody here to kind of get some feedback and be prepared at our next meeting to kind of go at that, so we can get something into the citizen for February at least. But yeah, I think there's a great opportunity. I think that's the thing we lost the last time in November of 2019. I mean, that was a real good one. You don't want to keep on going back and regurgitating everything. I think we want to take what we have and build upon it. And I think there was some great topics brought up and great opportunities. So I think that's what we got to work on now. Keep it going.
Good.
Okay. Anything else? Project updates. I don't have anything else. New member recruitment. If you know of anybody, I know I've been trying to beat the bushes, trying to get see if anybody else is interested. But we know how that's a difficult thing these days too. But anything else anybody would like to add or talk about this evening? I know the hour's getting late. Somebody probably saw my dog. Usually goes to bed at 8 o'clock, so he wasn't happy tonight. You know, I'm surprised he's not snoring in the background. Okay, any other thoughts, anybody? If not, then we'll look to adjourn the meeting at 9:19.
Take care, everybody.
Thanks. Take care. Have a good evening. Hey, and then Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. And
Good day to you.
Same to you.
much health and
Thank you.
happiness to all.
Thank you.
Take
you.
care.
Good night.
Good
Good night.
night.
Good night.